want to get into this Travis Hunter question, because before we talk about the quarterbacks who probably have the chance to win it, Travis Hunter is one of the most interesting players we've had in college football in a long, long time. The first real true two-way star in years. Because like Charles Woodson won the Heisman in 1997, was playing some receiver, but he was not a full-time receiver. He was not the kind of two-way player that Travis Hunter is. Like, my thing with Travis Hunter is, if he is their wide receiver one and has like 1,500 receiving yards, that's probably too many. It has like 1,200 receiving yards and is their best corner and is really good all season, even if they're 6-6, like, he's got to be on a ballot.
Yeah, I think, and I had in my top 10, because I did them by each power conference, and then I released kind of an overarching top 10 at On3 this past week. I had Hunter not in that top 10 overall, but I had him as kind of the dark horse candidate for this exact thing that you just kind of laid out. And I think it also helps Travis Hunter that he's a guy that he's going to have the story that, he spurned Florida State and went to an HBCU, then followed Dion to Colorado. He's the guy that's the cover art athlete for the new EA Sports game that everyone's so excited about. So if all that momentum then kind of materializes into the kind of season that you laid out, I think his candidacy would be legitimate. And then it would kind of be, is it good enough to tip the scales over if a quarterback, also kind of has a really dynamic and amazing year? That's TBD. But I think that Hunter, of all the guys that are non-quarterbacks, he easily, Andy, has the best kind of arc plus story plus potential equals, dark horse candidacy. Like, I don't see it for a guy like Ollie Gordon for the big picture. If you're breaking down like I did Big 12 candidates, yes. But when you're talking about it from a national perspective, I think there's a lot bigger hill to climb there for a guy like Ollie Gordon or some of these other tailbacks.
Well, you got yelled at about Ollie Gordon because you did your conference by conference columns last week, and then you did a top 10, and you didn't have Ollie Gordon in your top 10. Now, Ollie Gordon was the best back in college football last year. We're assuming he's going to be the best or one of the best backs in college football this year. One thing I will throw out, especially if you're looking at Big 12 futures, this is something to consider. Oklahoma State may have the oldest offensive line in the history of college football this year. So that bodes well for Oklahoma State and for Ollie Gordon, any sort of Heisman candidacy or just statistical measure. Ollie Gordon's going to be good this year.
And if you make the case for Ollie, it's that, he didn't even become like the guy for Oklahoma State until week 4 last season. And then he rushed off and ended up leading the team leading the nation in rushing. Now, the flip side of that a lot of Oklahoma State fans don't seem to be willing to acknowledge is that because they kind of put so many miles on him in one season, Gundy decided, hey, let's give him some help. And they brought in multiple really interesting tailbacks out of the transfer portal. So it's still going to be the Ollie Gordon show, but I think they're going to kind of, ease some of those carries to some other guys, which again, if you're a running back in these days, Andy, I think the threshold minimum is a 2,000-yard guy that's leading a team that's making it to the playoff.
Yeah, the problem for running backs, and this is as the game's evolved and quarterbacks run more, is there will be quarterbacks who throw for 3,000 yards and run for 750, 1,000. So your 1,400-yard rushing season compared to that just does not look that great. Like what? Here's a guy, and you've talked about this guy as one of your potential winners, Jalen Milroe at Alabama. Jalen Milroe has the potential to be a touchdown machine because of how athletic he is in the run game. He's going to throw for a bunch of touchdowns in Kalen DeBoer's offense. But if he's fully unleashed as a runner as well, he could have, Tebow, Cam Newton type touchdown numbers if he has a really good year. Like, that's going to be pretty hard to compete against if you're a running back, if you're a receiver, if you're anything else.
Exactly. If you're talking about a guy who could, top 45 total touchdowns, because Kalen DeBoer has proven at various stops that if he has a guy at the quarterback position that has some wheels, he'll run them. and he'll run them a lot. And I think with those other tailbacks, with Justice Haynes and Jam, they're gonna be a team that kind of leans on that big offensive line, which had two of the best transfer additions, and getting the Boomerang Proctor and then the center from Washington. So I think Milroe could easily have 45 touchdowns, and you're just not competing against that if you're an Ollie Gordon, even if you have 2,000 yards and 20 scores. That looks really good. Looks really good. But that looks really good in 1999. In 2024, when these quarterbacks are doing what Jaden Daniels and some of these other guys are doing, it's just apples to oranges.
So do we think it's probably going to be an SEC or Big Ten player? It feels like the hill to climb for the Big 12 guys and the ACC guys and then everybody else is pretty steep.
Yeah, I mean, you really have to. I think you really have to pick some nits. Here's the one exception, Andy. Because there's been such bubbling hype around this team all off season, and there is kind of like a feast or famine feel, I think, with a lot of folks about the Miami Hurricanes. Cam Ward is probably the exception to that. It's going to be a Big Ten. It's going to be an SEC guy, because Miami's going to start high enough in the polls where they're going to have some shine. They obviously have the huge Week 1 game against Florida, but they haven't, because Mario hasn't done it yet. If Cam does become kind of the guy that is the prince that was promised and
Right.
kind of brings them home, I think Cam Ward, and he's a guy much like Jalen Milroe that could have 40 total touchdowns. He doesn't have quite Milroe's upside athleticism, but he will run. And so you get him some red zone scores. Miami has some running back concerns as is. So if he poaches some of those touchdowns and then throws, Miami hasn't had a 3,000-yard passer since 2017, which coincidentally or not coincidentally, Andy, is the last time they won 10 games. So if he kind of helps them break through that glass ceiling, I could see him being the exception there. Otherwise, we're talking about a Quinn Ewers, a Milroe, a Beck. Dylan Gabriel's going to be up there. I'm skeptical that I think Will Howard's odds are super inflated. The fact that he has the fourth best preseason odds seem kind of crazy to me when he hasn't even been named the starter. But as I wrote, I mean, that's kind of what you get when you become the quarterback for what many people believe is the first or second best team in the nation.
Yeah, it really, they're looking at the roster around him. And the most interesting dynamic to that is there's a reason Will Howard is at Ohio State and not back at Kansas State, and that's because Kansas State is starting Avery Johnson. We have two of these situations because Dylan Gabriel's not at Oklahoma because they're starting Jackson Arnold. And I don't think Jackson Arnold is a better quarterback than Dylan Gabriel right now, but they're looking at the ceiling. They're looking at how much eligibility is remaining. Avery Johnson, same deal. And you had the situation last year where they tried to kind of force Avery Johnson into that role. Will Howard wouldn't give it up necessarily. So that one's going to be an interesting dynamic. But the Will Howard thing, he has so much talent around him. It's very hard to not look at that and say, well, he could put up some big numbers. But let's go to the situation that he left. Avery Johnson, who I'm telling everybody now, you have not seen a quarterback this fast since Lamar Jackson. Now, I don't know if he can throw like Lamar Jackson. We have not seen that yet. We've seen a couple nice throws. That's all we've seen so far, a couple nice throws. It's not like the year that Jackson took over. When Jackson was a freshman, he had basically the whole back half of his freshman year where he took over that Louisville offense. Louisville was like Bobby Petrino's tweaking things. And by the end of the season, by the time they played Texas A&M in that bowl game, the offense was then built around Lamar Jackson. And you saw in the bowl game exactly what it could be. Avery Johnson started the bowl game because Will Howard had already left, but they've changed. Like Colin Klein goes to Texas A&M, the OC. They bring in Matt Wells, who's going to work with him. Now they've promoted from within as well, so they've got some continuity there. But we have not yet seen that offense built around Avery Johnson yet. We haven't seen him have a chance to be the thrower that you need to be to put up these numbers.
Yeah, and they obviously brought him some help. Kansas State, I think, really upgraded at playmaker. They brought in, Dante Cephas didn't work out at Penn State. I think he may find a better feel there with the Kansas State Wildcats. And then they brought in Avery's buddy, from Colorado, the former Pee Wee teammates. And that's a tailback room that's going to give him a lot of support because they bring back the number 2 rusher in the Big 12 there as well. So we haven't seen him throw the ball yet, Andy. I'm as high as him. You and I are both super high on him. I mean, he's going to be one of the. You know what? When people are going to realize how fast he is, Andy, is when they play with him on the NCAA game.
Yes,
and they're like,
agreed.
He's just zooming past people, and it's like suddenly everyone is playing with Kansas State more than they've ever played with a program like that before. We're watching a thing of Nico here, Avery Johnson, Nico, Jackson Arnold, these sophomore phenoms. They're kind of all, I would say, sleeper candidates, but they fit. Kind of bringing this conversation full circle. I think they fit really well into a lot of years. Maybe if they lose a couple of games, they probably wouldn't be in the mix for the Heisman. But if they're as mesmerizing and kind of electric as people expect, if they're 10-2 or 9-3 and their team is in the mix, they have a shot. They could have the quote unquote sex appeal or the appeal, the Q rating that maybe a Carson Beck doesn't have, or people are like, we've seen Dillon Gabriel. Let's give it to the new flashy thing.
Chicken 15 and 15 in the chat correcting me. We have seen a quarterback as fast as Lamar since Kyler Murray. Let's give Kyler his flowers on that. But Avery Johnson is in that category in terms of speed. The question is he in that category in terms of arm? We don't know that yet. We'll find out. But let's talk about Dillon Gabriel, because you mentioned him. Jackson Arnold takes over at Oklahoma. That sends Dillon Gabriel to Oregon. So Dillon Gabriel, similar story to that of Bo Nix, where he comes into Oregon, where Oregon's kind of a fully formed offense, very good offensive line, lots of playmakers around him. But I would argue that Dillon Gabriel was more successful in his prior career than Bo Nix was before he went to Oregon.
Yeah, no argument here. No argument here. And now he's going to have the best supporting cast he's ever had. I mean, he's going to be playing behind an offensive line that I think is probably second or third best in the Big Ten. Maybe even first. I mean, I think they're certainly better than Ohio State's offensive line, which I had a column this past week. I think that could be kind of the one bugaboo for the Buckeyes. But I mean, Gabriel led the Big 12 last year in his first season. In every single category. So passing, yards per attempt, touchdowns. He's a guy, again, he's not going to run a ton, but he'll poach some scores. And so if he could easily get 10 touchdowns rushing, and that just adds to the figure. So the stats are going to be there. Obviously, Oregon's loaded at receiver with Trayshawn Holden. They bring in Evan Stewart, the 5-star from Texas A&M. You bring back Tez Johnson, who was kind of the big transfer portal hit a year ago from Troy. It's very easy to kind of build the potential for Dillon Gabriel's Heisman candidacy. Now, again, are folks going to say we've kind of seen him put up these stats at UCF and Oklahoma, and so maybe they won't be as impressed with it? I don't know, but I mean, if he leads a team that could be, as good as any in the country, it's hard to overlook that.
Yeah, and you look at that offense. We had Will Stein on the show a couple of weeks ago. He's working to kind of mold the offense around what Dillon Gabriel does best, as opposed to Bo Nix. But the things Dillon Gabriel does well are already what Bo Nix did well at Oregon in terms of he's accurate. The lower yardage passes, he's extremely accurate on. So like you're talking about a high 70s completion percentage with playmakers and also the ability to run. Now, Bo Nix is a good athlete too, but there is so much to like about Dillon Gabriel. I thought it was an interesting, here's an interesting point from Angel in the chat. USC QB Miller Moss will surprise and lead his team to 10-2 and the CFP. Quick release, accurate, and a good decision maker. He's a sleeper on no one's Heisman watch list. Fight on. Angel's a USC 78 grad. I am not opposed to this take at all. I watched Miller Moss in that bowl game. He looked spectacular. And what do we always say on the show? We never worry about Lincoln Riley's offense. We just worry about his defense. Like Miller Moss, I would imagine is going to have a good year.
I mean, look, there's no quibbles here. And I did not have Miller Moss on my top 10 overall list. But on the Big Ten list, I had him listed as the wild card candidate. And I basically said, I mean, it's probably pretty smart to put a Lincoln Riley quarterback on any of these preseason lists, even if you are skeptical maybe of Miller Moss's upside, because of just Riley's history with the quarterback position and getting these guys to either win the award or become a Heisman finalist in New York City. Like you mentioned, I mean, Miller Moss had a monster bowl game, throws 5 touchdowns, but then he struggles mightily this spring, has a terrible spring game, and you know, they bring in Jaden Maeva to potentially compete for the job. So I think it's more likely that he loses his job to the UNLV transfer than actually wins the Heisman. But he at least merits mention because of Lincoln Riley's history with the position.
They also open against LSU. It'll be our first look at Garrett Nussmeier as the full-time LSU starter. And that's like a pure old school thing. Well, Carson Beck, I guess, at Georgia had that situation last year where you had the guy who waited his turn behind the really good quarterback, and now he finally gets his turn. So Garrett Nussmeier, another one to potentially watch. Let's talk Carson Beck, though. We haven't talked Carson Beck yet. This is the guy who we said Will Howard's up there because he's got this great roster around him. Carson Beck has the achievement of being the full-time starter at Georgia last year, looked very good. Maybe the top NFL draft prospect in this class. And, oh, by the way, the roster is pretty awesome around him.
Yeah, honestly, Andy, I would say that the biggest demerit potentially against Carson Beck is that typically Jaden Daniels, notwithstanding last season, because he actually was the preseason favorite, most of the time the preseason favorite for this award just simply isn't the winner. You know, they might be in the mix most of the year, but, you know, folks get sour if there's one bad performance or one bad game. They'd rather, you know, boost somebody up if, say, a Connor Wegman, you know, leads Texas A&M to a surprising season, or like we mentioned with the Nico or a Dylan Gabriel, if he kind of, you know, leads Oregon to new heights. But I think, I mean, Beck, it certainly seems like the stars are aligned for him to just have a monster senior season. He returns to school. Georgia's upgraded the receiver position. They lose Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey, yes, but you get Lovett to come back to school. You get Ra to come back to school, and then you bring in Colby Young from Miami. You bring in Trevor Etienne from Florida to play tailback. The weapons that he's going to have at his disposal. You bring in the kid. I know Jim Nagy is really high on the tight end from Stanford. You know, and so there is no shortage of weapons and playmakers at Carson Beck's disposal. He's not a guy that turns the ball over that much. I think you could see Georgia need to actually air it out a little bit. And the fact, Andy, that as dominant as Georgia's been the last couple of seasons, they haven't lost a regular season game in a couple of years. They're going to be tested this fall. And so if Carson Beck can lift them up in a game at Texas, in a game at Alabama, I mean, these are going to be primetime opportunities. He shows out in those games, then absolutely he deserves to be kind of the number one front runner for the Heisman Trophy.
When you look at that Georgia schedule and you see possibilities of Heisman candidate versus Heisman candidate, now we don't know exactly how they're going to perform early season, so whether they'll be in the mix at that point, we don't know. But he's got to play against Milroe at Alabama. He's got to play against Quinn Ewers at Texas. He's got to play against Jaxson Dart at Ole Miss. We haven't talked about Jaxson Dart yet, but Jaxson Dart, if Juice Wells is healthy, like Juice Wells and Trey Harris could be the Brian Thomas and Malik Neighbors to Jaxson Dart's Jaden Daniels this year.
Yeah, with a Jordan Watkins who's playing the Kyron Lacey role. I mean, they're and they've Lane decided, Lane chose violence with the transfer portal in the trenches
Yeah.
there, because not only he looked at what happened to them in that Georgia game last season and said, not only do we need to recruit basically a completely mercenary defense, but if we want to have any hopes of actually getting in these, battle royales with these big boys, we have to upgrade on the offensive line. And so they just grabbed as many as they could, and they said, "Hey, let's let the chips fall where they may. The best guy's going to play." They held the competition over the spring. We enter summer, with continued competition there. I mean, they're going to start a bunch of transfers on the offensive line. Several of the guys from Washington. They grabbed some other. So, I mean, Dart again. You talk about support and the pieces around him. Ole Miss is very well positioned there, and Dart's a guy, again, bears repeating. He can do it both ways. Jaxson Dart can, he'll run and he'll throw his body into the fire, and take some
that's the
hits.
part
And
I'm worried
so,
about with him.
yeah, exactly. And somehow Jaden Daniels survived, so we'll see if Jaxson Dart can do so similarly. But the Ole Miss thing is, for him, he's going to have to show out. Ole Miss has a favorable schedule this year. It's up right now on the screen. He's going to have to show out in some of those key games at LSU, Oklahoma versus Jackson, Arnold, and then the big game versus Georgia in that late November setting.
So Nathan in the chat asked another interesting question. Are there any freshmen who could shock the world and end up in New York? Not necessarily we're assuming they end up in New York. That's as Jesse pointed out, that's a different question. But yeah, could there be any true freshman finalists? We still haven't had a true freshman win the award. It's going to happen at some point, just because you have these freshman QBs who come in. Nathan is a Nebraska fan, so I know where he's nudging us.
I was going to say, I mean, Dylan Raiola is easily the top candidate, and that's because, again, you put in potential plus story and the arc that if Nebraska, which hadn't gone to a bowl game in 6 or 7 seasons, not only finally tops that 6-win plateau, but is maybe a Big Ten contender. If he gets Nebraska to the Big Ten championship, then Dylan Raiola would probably, based on how that would likely have to play out. Obviously, Tony White's defense is really good there, but that would probably mean that the freshman quarterback was the prince who was promised, and kind of the prodigal son coming home and leading them. Our producer here, River Bailey, is shouting out the number 1 player, Jeremiah Smith. I think that's kind of a thing that he'd be great if the receiver position didn't seem to be fairly watered down in terms of how Heisman voters have viewed that spot in recent years. And so is he going to be, I think he's going to be awesome, but I would be skeptical that he is so dynamic that people think that he is the absolute best player on a loaded Buckeyes team.
You have to be utterly dominant. And Christopher mentions a freshman, but not as a potential winner this year. He says, hot take, Cam Coleman will win the Heisman his sophomore season next year. Cam Coleman, the Auburn freshman receiver this year. So he's talking about a Cam Coleman for Heisman campaign in 2025. I do think Cam Coleman probably has a chance to make a bigger impact on Auburn than Jeremiah Smith has to make on Ohio State, because Ohio State already has some other like they got Emeka Buka, they got Carnell Tate. Cam Coleman could be the threat at Auburn. So like that of the freshmen, even though Jeremiah Smith might wind up being better, we'll see. They're both really good, but Cam Coleman might make the bigger impact as a true freshman. Thank you so much for watching. Just a reminder, subscribe to this channel right here so you never miss an episode of Andy Staples On 3. And oh, by the way, watch all the other great videos on the On3 Sports YouTube channel.